why don't we get to our game review? All right, shifting gears. Today we are going to talk about Indonesia. This is a Splotter game from 2005. The designers are, and I'm going to apologize for not getting these names great, but the designers are Geraldine Duman and Joris Verzinga. The artist is Jeroen Keselaar and Ints Moet. All right, let me actually explain this game to people and do a game review here. Okay, so Indonesia. Speaking of colonialism or imperialism,
Yep.
so this is one of those games where the player with the most money at the end wins. Like, this is a kind of class of games. Like, how do you win? You have the most money at the end. So in the game of Indonesia, each player plays the role of a rich dude who is going to start and operate companies in the Southeast Asian islands of what will become Indonesia. So what we are doing is we are acquiring companies that we will then operate, shipping goods to different cities in the region, which would then pay us for those goods. So this is an economic game. But this is also like one of these games where you are not your company. You are, I'm saying like rich guy, because the companies are things that you acquire, but you may not hold on to them for the entire game. The goal is to make money you personally. It's not just run a good company. Like, running a good company can make you a lot of money, but you also, like, that's not, running the good company is not the end goal. Exploiting that company or using it to help you make money, that is the goal. It's one of those games. So this game is played over 3 historical eras. In each era, new companies become available to be acquired. So at the beginning of the game, this would be a rice company or a spice company. And then later on, it will be rubber or even oil. The number of products that you can kind of deliver to the cities that they will pay you for, and the amount they pay you changes as the game progresses. In addition to that, there are shipping companies, and shipping companies are the means which these goods get delivered from the place in which they're produced to the cities that need them and will pay you for them. And there's money to be made by transporting these goods. So if I have a rice company, it exists at a specific spot on the map, and I produce rice for every chit I have on a space on the map, and then I need to ship that rice to a city. And if I do this, yay, I get paid for my rice, but I have to pay the shipping company for each space the rice traveled to go through. So if I sold my rice at a city for $20 cash, which is the price that cities pay for rice, I have to pay a shipping company $5 cash to get it there. And maybe it's more than 5. If it traveled 2 spaces, it's 10. And it can actually continue to go up, so much so that I might even pay more to transport my rice than it was actually worth in the first place. So I can lose money on the deal. I have to try to sell every thing that I produce in the game. And so that's one of the kind of richnesses of the game. The other thing is if you do this, if you successfully export get your rice and you deliver it to the cities, then you get to expand. So the size of your company increases. That's a good thing. It means your like stake in this company goes up. If you didn't successfully do this, you can still expand your company, but you have to pay for it. Players are going to operate their companies one at a time in turn order until all the companies have been operated. So this kind of delivering your goods to a city, it's actually like very simple, but in practice on the board, it becomes deeply complex. And that's before we even get into mergers. And mergers are where this game really kind of super splatters and goes to the next level, which is that as the game progresses, players can create mergers between companies of similar type. And in fact, you can be forced to merge. And then you have an auction to determine who will actually control this larger merged company in the future, with the person who gets outbid essentially getting bought out and getting a large influx of cash into their personal coffers. So like, you lost your company, but now you have a ton of cash. And so you can buy some other company. All right, Dimitri, does this sound like the game you've played?
This is the game that I played. This is my favorite Splatter game. I want to mention something that Paul said about it, which after playing it about a dozen times, he says he's just beginning to actually understand it. But this is a game that is something essential for me, has an essential quality for me, can be enjoyed without fully understanding it for a variety of reasons. Your explanation of it is excellent. It makes it sound a little dry. Makes it sound like, oh, it's a stock game, it's a company game. But it's every time a company expands, it expands geographically. So this is also an area control game. It is also a production game, and how you produce and when you produce is not just interesting and not just complicated, it's also intuitive. You can look at the board and you
Mm-hmm.
can see what's going to happen, and you can plan in advance. When your company expands, you may be taking over territory that Tom's company is hoping to expand into. So there's an interesting way in which players can come into conflict. It's also a shipping game, and it's a shipping game with a lot of the mechanisms of 18xx and Age of Steam built into it. It's an engine building game because there's so many things you can improve in your abilities. You can improve how many companies you can merge into one when you propose a merger. You can improve your shipping. You can improve your growth. It's a game where you can focus on production or on shipping and see if you can win just with shipping alone. It's a game where there's definitely a pivot at some point where it becomes really profitable to propose a merger, and you better be the first person to do it, and you better have enough money to be able to buy the resulting company. All of these mechanisms are do two things. One is the game very quickly gets out of the way, so you're actually competing with your fellow players. You're also cooperating with your fellow players because delivering goods to a city can make it grow, can make it expand, which means it can accept more goods, which is profitable for everybody. And it's also a beautiful game. It's a gorgeous map. The rules are intuitive. You keep waiting for the oil and the rubber to come on the scene. You can combine your rice and spice into Siafajit, which is like a TV dinner company, which is always.
Right. It's the most difficult concept in the game is that at a certain point you can actually like merge your rice company with your spice company and create a new product that sells for much more. So this is
Yeah,
one of those workarounds from like shipping kind of choking you out, is that you need more expensive goods that you can ship over greater distances without going into debt.
you can also merge companies on different islands, which produce the same thing. So that gives you a new base of operations to ship from. There's so many considerations, so many rich decisions. Uh, and I always feel like I'm not fighting the game. The game is actually letting me do what I want, which is a hallmark of splatter games. I'm actually interacting, sometimes cooperating, and sometimes competing with the fellow players who are making my life miserable, but also really, really interesting. Can I propose this merger before TREY does? Can I get enough money for my company if I wind up the loser? Or should I even consider selling? So I'll get more money to buy something else. And it's a beautiful board. It's a game that combines Age of Steam and 18xx mechanisms for me really beautifully.
Or
While
like simplified versions of those things, right? Like
yes,
it's
I
not
would
like
say
on some level I feel like this 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 game's very like the actual things you have to do are very simple, and they produce rich gameplay, which is kind of a splatter thing. I like one of the things you're saying before. I don't know whether it's cooperation exactly, but it is certainly the case in this game that you can't do it all yourself. Like you need help, especially early on in the game. Like you might control a rice company. It's like you're not going to have a shipping company to deliver your goods yet. You're going to have to use someone else's shipping company. So there's like a constant negotiation, or even like I'm going to use somebody's shipping company because like they're committed to this area, and then I'm going to build near it so that I know I can use a shipping company to do it. Your comment before where Paul starts to feel like after 10 plays he's starting to get it. I always find like when I start to feel like I understand this game, my next game immediately humbles me. Like the lessons of splatter games always remain elusive. There's plenty of games where you pull a certain lever and you get a kind of result that I can count on. In splatter, I often feel like I pull a lever and a couple of steps happen and something completely unexpected happens that I didn't predict, and it calls into question like, why did I pull that lever? Should I pull this lever? And that's kind of delicious. And like at the core of this may be again this like merger question of like when, like you said, there can be some importance of like who decides, who can call a merger so you can control who gets merged together. And then there's this, fantastic thing that happens in the auction, which is when you have an auction over a merger, the price gets bid up, and you have a kind of very difficult decision about, like, generally one person is going to have more money than the other, and so you can tell who can win it, but whether they should win it is another question, because losing a merger fight, losing with quotes, might be great. It might, if the price of a merger gets really bid up, you suddenly have tons of cash to do other things. That can be the right move, is to lose a merger sometimes. And that's a really rich decision space that I continue to struggle to consolidate, maybe.
What's interesting for me about this auction in Indonesia is it's the best auction of all games because it's the auction where everybody has the most complete information. In all other games I can think of, Estates, Fresh Fish, Age of Steam, the auction requires you to kind of have a grasp on what you're bidding on what its actual value is in the future gameplay. But here you have complete information. You can see the board state. You know what the company is producing. You can actually calculate what a company should be worth. And then of course that would be the starting bid. And how much do you want to hurt Tom? How much do you want? He really wants this company to keep producing. But if you hurt him badly, if you take the merged company away from him, you're giving him a ton of cash. And maybe he sees another merger possibility that you don't. But of course, again, it's right in front of you. It's right under your nose on this beautiful map.
Yeah, that can be that calculation you're talking about. In like that may be like my most negative thing, and there's very little about this game that I think negative, is that like that can be mathy. Like you said, that's not hidden, but there are times when you can look and say, we know we're only going to play one more round of this game, so I only have like one more operation. That operation on the final turn is going to be worth double, so you can kind of like figure out exactly how much value a company is going to be worth. So for some people that might get too mathy. I mean, it's still just multiplication, but like that would be, there are times where you break out the pencil and decide, like what's the pain point where I'm spending too much for what I'm going to get later on. But I do find like that moment of trying to decide how far do I push an auction is kind of delicious and also very frustrating, in that I'm often in that moment where I just say, I don't know. Like I don't have any confidence about where I should stop here or not. And that's kind of rich. And maybe if I understood the game better, I would feel more confidence in that. But it's also pleasurable being in that I don't know frame of mind there. Plenty of times, Dimitri, you and I both have rice, or we're going to form a set 5G company, and you hold the rice and I hold the spice, and we have the biggest shares in these companies. But anyone can bid on it as long as they have the slot in order to take it. It's just that they would be paying out both of us for our shares, but that means that the auctions are often involved the entire table.
And shipping, when there are mergers in shipping, everyone can have it can have huge consequences for everybody. Not just for the people who are shipping, but who actually own the shipping companies, but people who need to ship. And the choice of how far something will ship and who ships first can affect whether you, as you mentioned before, make money or lose money on a deal. Actually, lose cash on a deal. So other players' decisions can affect you in multiple ways and have ripple
Right.
effects that spread out from the initial choice, which again are very rich. On the other hand, not terribly complicated. They're not
The
difficult.
mechanism is not complicated. The implications might be more so. So one thing I want to do, you at one point kind of talked about this as a stock game. I want to put a little asterisk on that and say this is not a stock game in the way that 18xx are stock games. Rather, you hold a deed to a company, and as you expand that company, like the number of spaces that you have on the board, that ends up being like the size of that company. So when we merge, and I have 5 rice spots in my company, and you have 3. If I have 5 rice and you have 3 spice, and we merge, I essentially have 5 shares and you have 3 shares. So they're not shares per se, but it is like a nice baby's first stock game in that it can kind of introduce that concept. It's played out pretty simply here. If you're not ready for the load of a true stock game the way 18xx games are. I also wanted to like hang my hat on the kind of very simple, it's not exactly a tech tree, but there's a research and development aspect to this game. That's on the board. If you look at the board, the very pretty board of Indonesia, you'll see it's just this box over in the corner. And the way it works is that every round you can improve one area. You can upgrade one area of the game. These are things like slots, which are the number of companies you can hold. You can upgrade your mergers, which means that you can have bigger and bigger mergers that fit into one of your slots. So you can have larger companies or propose bigger mergers by having more mergers. If you're running shipping companies, you need to expand your hull, which is the amount that your ships can carry. So, you can deliver more goods, you can make more money. They even have an interesting thing which is called expansion, which means that like when I expand, either by paying for it or that I successfully delivered all my goods. Normally you start out like when you expand, you just add another square. I can expand my company into one other area. But if I've upgraded my expansion, I can expand into 2 companies or 3 companies. And again, this is kind of like important. And that means that when I merge, I will have more shares that I can get paid for. So it's a way of like building your investment in your own companies, both in terms of the amount of goods you make and in terms of like the quote unquote stocks that you hold in your company. So if you're an engine builder mindset, which I tend to be, expansion can look really attractive. Then there's turn order in this game. And turn order is this interesting thing. It can be super important. It can determine the order that you pick your companies. It can determine the order in which you operate your companies. And this can be super important because you're always racing to get your goods to market. So we have an auction for turn order. And one of the interesting quirks about the game is that you spend money to determine your turn order in this game, but then you save that money and it counts towards your score in the end, so that money's not completely lost. And then one of the things you can upgrade in the game through the research and development action is you can get a multiplier on that bid, so that if I upgrade it, the $1 that I spend for turn order, it can now be 10. So you start to get efficiencies in terms of controlling the game through turn order. And that was one thing, like when we first started playing the game, we didn't appreciate how important that was. And I feel like the more we've played it, the more that looks like a viable option. Like all of the choices here in terms of what you can expand in R&D feel completely viable, and I'm still struggling to value them. I feel like each of these are viable ways to go at the beginning of the game and make the gameplay really interesting. But it's also simple. It's really easy to understand. So when you look at certain games and you're looking at tech trees or how do you expand what people can do, go back and look at Indonesia and like their super simple way of like expanding your power or your tech tree through the course of the game.
This game is obviously for our group. Uh,
Right.
it hits a sweet spot. Um, I believe it's the second game that Matt played with us way
Uh-huh.
back when
Maybe.
new. I remember him coming in. He actually lived in Indonesia for a bit when his father worked there. He spent
Huh.
summers there, and he taught us some Indonesian words while playing it. What's interesting to me is at that time, Matt was not a huge gamer. Matt
Mm-hmm.
started playing games with us. He was interested, but this was maybe one of the first, definitely the first Splotter he ever played, and maybe one of the first board games he took seriously. You know, with his second time with Tom at Tom's game night, I think he enjoyed this immensely. I think it's very rare that a game that is challenging and interesting to someone like Paul or someone like you can also be enjoyed by a relative newcomer. And I think he was actually a contender. I think we all were
Mm-hmm.
contenders in that game until Tom ran away with it because I believe, if I remember correctly, this was years ago. He actually did the mathy calculation at the end with the doubled value of the production and knew exactly how to take advantage of it.
Yeah, Tom seems to excel at auction games, especially when it's about like correct pricing or taking things past a certain pain point where other people will balk and he will not. I'm certainly thinking of this game. Like there's a number of games that like have come out in the last year and a half that I'm kind of eager to play when I'm in person. But I think if we were going to have a game night tomorrow with our game group, like this might be my choice of a game to play with our group that would engage us in the things that we want to engage in.
I think the game uh, City of Big Shoulders is a game that certainly brings to my is brought to my mind when I think of Indonesia, um,
Right.
because there's a certain friendliness to it. Even there's a lot of competition, right? But the barrier of entry is fairly low. I don't think you're going to have the kind of debate about rules and initial conditions and which companies are available at the beginning of Indonesia, where that you can have when you're trying to play an 18xx game. And if you get one thing wrong, you know the whole game is going to be ruined, and you'll have to start
Right.
all over. Um, Jim Shveda, who is a classical commentator at KPCC, or one of our public stations, and who wrote a big book of classical music reviews, once said, "You can't have the Ninth Symphony every day." You know, it's just too big of an ask. But Indonesia is one of those games that is incredibly serious, incredibly crunchy, but easier, easier to get into. For me, it's the
Yeah.
easiest plotter to get into. It's much easier and more intuitive than Food Chain Magnet. It's also
Mm-hmm.
a full meal as opposed to the appetizer of bus. And for me, as an alternative to Age of Steam, there's something. Uh, it just has a little more meat on the bones than Age of Steam, uh,
Sure.
because it's also a production game. right? It's also a merger game. And it has a much more beautiful map. It just has things to. It has a dessert, whereas Age of Steam is just this big Flintstones like hunk of meat that you have to attack with knife and fork and try to get through. If that metaphor makes sense.
Sure. Well, you mentioned this is your favorite Splotter. This is also my favorite Splotter. I went back and looked at, when we did our top 20 games for Game Brain. This made my top 20 list. I think I had this as my 11th favorite game. Oh, no, ninth favorite game. The super fan among our group is Paul. I think Paul had this as his sixth highest rated game, and it also made Jennifer's list. It didn't make your list. Do you think it would make a top 20 list for you now?
It would. My top 20 list at the time had much more to do with what we were playing at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I insisted on putting in fun games like um, um, Sheriff of
Fun
Not.
games. Fun
The
games. No, I'm just saying. So is this game not fun or
party games. I should say
okay?
party
Party
games
games.
and
All right.
shorter games for reasons that had to do more with politics and image than had to do with like my genuine appreciation. And uh, I was deliberately avoiding putting on games that I felt other people would, and um, one of
That's
the
okay. You don't have to defend your list. I just more wanted to get towards
yeah, one of the questions
that you're a fan.
one of the
Yeah.
questions I have for you is,
Oh.
I had no idea that you love this so much more than Food Chain Magnet. I
Oh
think we
yeah.
put together our 20 games list before the second edition came out and before you reviewed it. Uh, I remember that your review of Food Chain Magnet, the Splotter game that's all the rage right now, was both appreciative and admiring and also cautious. And I, I want you to. I'd like you to elaborate on that. I like compare the two.
Sure.
Why do these games seem to have such a different effect on different people? Who are they for? Do you feel the designers consciously design these games for different audiences?
Yeah, the distinction I would make, and I think, listen, like Tom loves Food Chain Magnate, and he champions that game. I I feel like you and I are championing Indonesia here, and like I can like respect Food Chain Magnate, while without being in love with it. I will certainly play it some more, and it certainly falls in the realm of like a game that I have a lot more to learn about. But it also kind of like frustrates me in a way that Indonesia never does. Like even when I'm losing in Indonesia, I feel like I'm doing interesting things and I'm really engaging. I made a mental note in thinking about splatter games. Like Indonesia was the game that made me really feel like, okay, these guys are geniuses. Splatters are gamers games, but especially this kind of thing where like they've created something that's so elusive in terms of the puzzle that it creates. And I realized that I have kind of bounced off of the splatter games that are a little more sandboxy, or the way I think of them is like they tend to have like a menu of things that you can do that you choose between. Like when you play Food Chain Magnate, you're looking at all of these milestones you have to get, and you're also looking at these progressions of like, I'm going to take a, uh, I don't remember, like they kind of level up in a sense that your delivery boy is going to become a truck driver, is going to become something else. Your fry cook become a a burger master or whatever, and like you have different levels of executives that go up, and so you have to sit there and study the menu in Food Chain Magnate. If you're playing Antiquity, there are 20 or so different buildings that you can build. And becomes a huge decision space in terms of like, what buildings do I build and in what order do I build them? If I play roads and boats, again, I'm kind of like looking at a menu. of options that I can do. And like that's what's kind of like amazing about these games, in that there's so much freedom for you to explore and to try different stuff, and there's totally different ways of doing stuff. um, I also tend to find that decision space to be almost like too large and overwhelming in a way that is not pleasurable. And I do gravitate towards Indonesia. I love bus. I like your appetizer thing. I think I do, and so like I'm gonna fall on that side of the splatter spectrum, and I would probably also include uh, Great Zimbabwe, and I would also include, like, I'm a big fan of Greed Incorporated. I always want to play Greed Incorporated, and it's kind of like the splatter game that doesn't get much attention. But if I'm having to study the menu, I'm finding I'm bouncing. Like Antiquity annoys me. I realize it's great, but I struggle with that game. Roads and Boats, brilliant, but it's like it's too much for me. And studying those options can be too much for me.
You mentioned milestones in Food Chain Magnet, and for me, milestones always make me feel like I'm playing against the game, and maybe the game is plotting against me. That maybe an order to the milestones or specific groupings of milestones. That if I don't get all of them or don't get them in the right order, I'm going to lose. And that has nothing to do with engaging the other players. It has to do with the game designer make me feel stupid and inadequate. And I know that that's not the key. But what I appreciate, and you called Indonesia a baby stock game, but when I play a game, I feel like a child. And there are many things like I have to learn rules, I have to sit there like in a class, I have to take turns, like all of those make me feel like I'm a kid again. And I liked being a kid. I don't mind feeling like a kid. So
You're
when
playing. You're playing. Yeah.
I'm playing, and when Indonesia also gives me
Yeah.
a beautiful map, it gives me TV dinners, and really isn't sitting on me. It isn't wrestling with me, but it is actually refereeing a wrestling match between me and you and Paul and Tom. I feel better. It makes me feel emotionally better. It makes me more able to have fun with it. I Has Ben played it? Do you know?
Has Ben played it?
Uh-huh.
I don't know.
I would love to know if he has, and I think it would be very interesting for to play it with him, because for me Ben is uh, between me and you in terms of where his tastes are. He's much more willing to engage in a really crunchy puzzle, I think, than I am. Uh, but he's also kind of interactive in a way that I think you love to engage the game itself. I almost always want to engage other people, and Ben, I think, is in between us. I wonder if this is going to be something he enjoys more than Food Chain Magnet, which he has said he loves and wants to play more of, or if he will think that it's too basic.
Yeah, I think it's hard for anybody to play Indonesia and come away and saying it's too basic. But I also, much like splatter games, trying to figure out Ben's tastes is elusive. I don't think I have an ability to predict what Ben is going to like or not like. He defies explanation or comprehension. But I agree. I'd be curious to see how he reacts to that. And he's certainly somebody who doesn't. You say you want to play against people, but I never think of you as an aggressive player.
No, no.
Uh,
I
Ben
just
does not shy away from aggression if the game calls for it. So he might really enjoy that. Like he's not uncomfortable with aggression the way some people are.
Yeah. For me, this is a full board euro that never that avoids the parallel play trap. I don't think it's possible to parallel play Indonesia. You're always interacting with other people, but it still feels
Well,
like
maybe define that. What define for people parallel play?
it's what Tom talks about, where you're just basically engaging your own. You're building your own empire. You're solving your own
Oh,
puzzle.
multiplayer solitaire. Oh
Thank you.
yeah, yeah. Right.
Multiplayer.
This you don't have your own board here at all.
Yes.
Everything's out there and is interactive in ways that are wonderful or frustrating. But yeah, although there's not a lot of direct aggression in this game, you are racing for spots, and you can make very important decisions in terms of like where you place your ships, in terms of what you're connecting or what you're not connecting. And there very much can be some play of like, I'm concerned that such and such a player is running away with things. So like my best move for me for the money, I might be to connect to that person's oil fields, but that would be game over and that person just straight up wins. Like you do make those kind of calculations, but that's not exactly the direct aggression, which often I don't like in games. This feels like the right amount of interactive decision making. That's not take that.
Any negatives for you that you might
But,
want to mention?
simple mechanisms. It can still be a little bit of a tough teach, but it's an appropriate teach for the game brain crowd. Like I said, there can be a little mathy later on where you can kind of like break out the pencil and decide, I'm going to have a certain number of operations at the end to determine stuff. But that would be it. This game has high replayability because your ability to kind of like figure it out remains completely elusive. I don't think there's a dominant strategy where you break the game by doing this one thing. Like that's completely outside the realm of possibility playing Indonesia. So no, very few negatives.
Yeah, one negative for me, it's the length of play. It's not necessarily a negative, but this is a 4 hour game.
Yeah.
And to me it feels like it should be a 2.5 to 3 hour game. I don't know why this plays consistently much longer than say Barrage. I have a feeling it's because at the end and with the mergers, people need to think about very hard and very long. Um, I don't know how I would shorten it. I don't think it can be shortened, but this can play longer than Food Chain Magnet. And
Oh,
right.
I don't know. It's just because they're meaty decisions, and I wouldn't surprise me at all if we had people write into the Facebook group and say, when we play Indonesia, we finish in 2.5 hours. Like we tend to take long. We take longer than a lot of other people when we play games, but that's just because these are important, meaningful decisions, and people in our group will take their time making them. I'm not bored at 4 hours. There are games that can be 2.5 hours. Like Prago is going to play a lot shorter, but I also feel like I can be trapped in that game. I haven't felt trapped in Indonesia. Even when I'm losing, I'm enjoying what I'm doing and I'm engaged. So it may be longer, but it didn't feel longer to me.
Remember when Matt comes over and he's a new player and we're going to bring out that game. Matt was ready to play a 4 hour game. And he was fully engaged. Not everyone could be. So this is a great introduction and a gateway game, in my opinion, for players, except for that thing. I wish it actually played in 2.5 hours because then it would be almost perfect.
They'd be the perfect game.
Hey, if you enjoyed that video, you very well might enjoy the other videos you now see being suggested to you on screen. Also, we'd greatly appreciate it if you could like, share, or subscribe to our Game Brain channel. Thanks so much.